welcome back to my channel. I am Danny, and today I want to talk about 3 fantasy books I read this spring that really stood out to me for approaching similar themes in very distinct ways. And those books are The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, The Daughter's War by Christopher Buehlman, and The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. All 3 of these fall under the umbrella of epic fantasy, though they each bend genre in their own ways, and all 3 engage deeply with heavy themes of grief and survival and the weight of legacy and culture on individuals and on societies. So in this video, I want to review each of these books, but also put them in conversation with each other, looking at what they have in common, where they diverge, and the ways in which each of these stretch the boundaries of genre. And I'm going to be talking about the themes and the writing style, but I'm going to do my best to avoid outright spoilers so that if you've read one or none of these, maybe this will help you figure out which one you might want to pick up next. First, I'll just give a brief overview of what each book is generally about in order from the biggest audience to the smallest audience, according to the number of Goodreads ratings each of these books have. First, with over 300,000 ratings on Goodreads and the only appearance by a sci-fi fantasy book on the New York Times Reader's Best Books of the 21st Century list, is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy. It is set in a world that is constantly rocked by catastrophic geological disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and there are also folks with magical earthbending abilities. In the book, these are called origins, and these people have the ability to control and quell that seismic activity, and these powers are both feared and exploited by the powers that be. If you are found to be an origin to have these magical abilities, because that power is so potentially dangerous to others and so useful for controlling and preventing these natural disasters, your choices are basically either to become trained and serve the Empire or to hide and risk being murdered by your village if anyone ever finds out about your true abilities. It also has a unique narrative structure where the story is told from the point of view of a child, and then a young adult woman, and an adult mother. And as a literary fiction lover myself, I think the unique way that those different points of view thread together over the course of the book is part of what makes this such a hit with the readership of the New York Times, in addition to general sci-fi fantasy lovers. Next, self-published with 70,000 ratings on Goodreads, is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. I'm trying to avoid putting too much comparison in this section of the video, but let me just say that this book also contains individuals with elemental bending type abilities, and it also contains multiple point of view characters. In this case, the primary point of view character is a young teenager named Mamoru, and also another point of view character is his mother, Misaki. And they are both members of the Matsuda family, who come from a long line of warriors and waterbenders that have protected the edge of the Kaigenese Empire for generations. As you can probably tell by those names, the Empire of Kaigen, where this story takes place, is heavily inspired by real-world Japan and the Japanese Empire. And it didn't register until I was about 100 pages into the book that the whole world map is our own world map basically flipped upside down. So that's fun. But this story is more of a martial fantasy with a blend of martial arts and elemental bending that is very reminiscent of Avatar: The Last Airbender. When the book starts, they are in peacetime, but at school Mamoru makes a friend abroad and is increasingly confronted with the idea that he has been fed propaganda about the Empire and that there may be a conflict brewing. The final book is The Daughter's War by Christopher Buehlman, with 7,500 ratings at the time of recording this video. This book stands on its own, but is technically a prequel to The Black Tongue Thief, And the setting of the Daughters' War is more typical Western D&D fantasy, and it follows Galva, a 20-year-old female knight who is going to war as a member of a special battalion of women that have giant ravens that were specifically bred to kill goblins. This is because this is the third Goblin War that humanity has come together to fight in as many generations. So this is a pretty straightforward war novel narrated by Galva as a candid, first-person retrospective on her time in the war, but tonally it also has a lot of elements from the horror genre, from the alien nature of the goblins and the descriptions of their brutality. The story of the war is also broadened by the fact that Galva's three brothers are also involved in this war. Galva's father is a duke, so her whole family has relatively comfortable positions in the army. One is a personal assistant to the wizard who created those war corvids, and the other two are soldiers with different levels of command. But essentially, this is a story of war, and it's a coming-of-age story for Galva. Next, I want to expand on some of the core similarities I saw in these books that made me want to put them in conversation with each other in the first place. On a structural level, like I said, these are all epic fantasy. They all feature large-scale, high-stakes conflict set in a secondary world. And the fifth season leans a little more dystopian, while the other two lean a little more military, but civilization as we know it is at stake in all of these stories. They are concerned with trauma and grief. They are concerned with the roles and burdens placed on women, especially mothers, and they are concerned with war and patriotism and the fact that bodies are being put on the line for some greater purpose, and the motivations and mechanisms that underpin that service can vary. Personal grief is core to all of these books. In the fifth season, this isn't a spoiler, it's in the first chapter and it's on the blurb. The book opens with a mother grieving the murder of her 3-year-old son because presumably he was discovered to have these geomagical abilities. That's the lens through which we see the treatment and the fear of origins in this society. And the other two books depict war. People lose loved ones. And I think all three of these books, in their own ways, portray grief, personal, familial grief, in really difficult but beautiful and moving ways. Another thread that really stood out to me with these books was the presence of adult female main characters and the conflict of them straining against traditional expectations of femininity and motherhood. Esun, the mother in the fifth season, and Misaki, the mother in the Sword of Kaigen, are both women who have buried aspects of themselves and their history as they have come into motherhood. Esun has been living a meek life to protect herself and her children, but she is in fact a very capable person, and facing the murder of her son and an apocalypse on the horizon, she is leaning on her street smarts and her skills as the story progresses. Similarly, Misaki is a mother in a very powerful traditional household in a patriarchal society that has very rigid expectations of women, but she lived abroad as a teenager. She's familiar with cultures that don't place the same boundaries on ladylike behavior that her own culture does. And a big part of the journey of this novel is Misaki reclaiming the parts of herself that she was forced to give up in order to be a more perfect wife and mother after she married into this powerful family. And finally, Galva in The Daughters' War isn't a mother, but her story still brushes up against traditional expectations of femininity. This is a world where women have been called to arms because the male population has been decimated by the previous two Goblin Wars. And my sense from reading was that Galva, being a duke's daughter, was not in a position where she needed to go fight in this war, but she signed up to be in this special unit out of a sense of duty and love for her homeland. And she is an extremely competent and honorable woman, and this leads to some friction with one of her brothers who is less competent and less honorable. She also realizes in the course of the story that she is a lesbian, and her queerness combined with her commitment to military service just comes across as this quiet form of rebellion against expectations on noble women. Another through line in these books is the ties between an individual and their country. In all of these books, the state, the empire, is under threat from either outside attack or from destructive seismic activity. And each of these books really considers how bodies are treated as assets or weapons for the state, and how propaganda and coercion is used to control those bodies. The magic systems in all of these books tie in directly to these questions of power and state control as well. We can see that the folks with magical abilities are incredibly valuable assets. And I think each of these books builds on real-world examples of slavery and militarism to explore how nations and individual commanders enforce obedience. So all of these books approach these themes in different worlds under different lenses, but at their core, they're grappling with what it means to live and fight under systems that demand obedience and sacrifice from the people within them. Now I want to return to each book, but this time with a focus on what makes them stand out individually and what kinds of readers I think they'll resonate with most. So starting with the 5th season, this leans more sci-fi in its magic system and in its zoomed out view of the rise and fall of civilizations. N.K. Jemisin puts a lot of thought into how a society might structure itself when it lives under the constant threat of seismic apocalypse. And that kind of speculative style, speculative rigor reminded me a lot of Ursula K. Le Guin. I also thought this book had great depictions of queerness and intimacy. We encounter queer and trans and polyamorous characters in a way where this is treated as normalized. And yet with the origins, we also see arrangements that echo real-world histories of forced reproduction and eugenics. And I think Jemisin treats all of this very delicately in a way that plays into the novel's larger themes around bodily autonomy. I'd recommend this book to almost anyone, but especially fans of sci-fi and literary fiction and anyone who is interested in explorations of oppression. For the Sword of Kaigen, I think what sets this book apart is the martial arts aspects and the generational split narrative structure. You have this 14-year-old boy's coming-of-age story as he is growing up in a family with a legacy of elite warriors, and he's finding that he needs to step up in a crisis. And you also have his mother watching him struggle with this and having a limited ability to help, and who is herself dealing with a different set of gendered expectations and obligations. And I thought the structure of the story provided a really interesting angle to reflect on how we continually grow and change throughout our lifetimes. However, that structure does result in some unevenness in tone. When the book starts, I felt it was like very much a young adult coming of age story. It was very shonen anime feeling. It was very Avatar: The Last Airbender feeling. And then there is a turning point in the novel where it sort of morphs and becomes much more of an adult military drama. And I also had some challenges with the way the exposition and the world building were done. There were a lot of made up words for units of measurement, words for units of time and currency mixed together with real Japanese terms of address and terms for items like katana and genkan that I found pretty distracting and unnecessary to use all of these foreign words, I guess. But I also feel like the nitpicks I had about the pacing and the world building are part of a two-sided self-publishing coin, where these things might have gotten smoothed out if this book were traditionally published, but the book also takes risks that a traditional publisher might not have gone for. And where this book really shines is in the battle descriptions, combat descriptions. I think it takes some special skill to be able to write martial arts and describe where bodies are in space, especially when the number of bodies in the fight begins to increase. But Emma Wong did that really effectively, and I think the fight scenes alone make me want to see this novel adapted. I think it could make a really good film if it were trimmed down a little bit. I'd recommend this to anyone who enjoys military fantasy and anyone who's interested in strong character arcs or reading about the complicated impact of living in a culture built on tradition and obedience. And finally, The Daughter's War is a very pure Western military fantasy, but as I said earlier, it also has some horror elements, and I also think it's pretty darkly funny. I think Buellman is really skilled at painting a portrait of the things that bring us joy and comfort, whether that is family, friends, food, art, religion, and especially pets and animals, and then showing very horribly how the goblins are a threat to all of those things. One of the world building things that Buellman establishes really early on is that the goblins introduced a plague that drove the horse population in this continent nearly to extinction. And Galva's family and country, which is basically fantasy Spain, loved their horses and was known for their horses. And just that detail of near total equine extinction makes this setting so unique in terms of what military warfare looks like and also what this war means to people and the impact the previous wars have had on their lives. I also really enjoyed the depiction of religion in this world. Galva has a sort of crisis of faith and begins worshiping the goddess of death during the war. And I thought the things the goddess of death represents and the way Galva's faith was handled was really interesting. I think this book is just a masterclass of fantasy world building, so I'd recommend it to anyone, but I especially recommend it to anyone who enjoys horror and anyone who enjoys exploration of complicated family and sibling dynamics. So that's all I have for today. I have my own preferences between these books, but I thought they were all really emotionally powerful books, so I wanted to connect the dots on the themes they shared a little bit more and think about what elements made them all successful for me. But I would love to know if you have read any or all of these books. Which ones do you connect to the most, or do you think that you would connect to the most? And if you have any recommendations for anything else to read in this vein, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and until next time.